I want to share a few excerpts from different interviews with senior Pentagon advisor Douglas MacGreger. And I've heard that he's been a bit, I'm not sure, Islamophobic in the past, but I haven't really come across those interviews. And he seems to be, from what I gather, fairly right on target with these appraisals of what's happening in Ukraine, how Zelensky is going, what the West really, really wants, and so forth. And I think you'll sort of see that it's similar to what's been positioned on this channel, taken from certain journalists and stuff. So I think you might find it interesting. It sort of reinforces a narrative that the US ultimately wants to have regime change in Russia, wants to separate China from Russia, and that kind of thing. Also, that Zelensky is really doing damage to his country by not just calling for Ukraine to be neutral, and he's following along, unfortunately, being led up the garden path by the US, and the US really doesn't care one way or the other what happens to Ukrainian citizens. Ukraine is just cannon fodder, and the US just really wants to turn it into a kind of Russia's Vietnam, but I don't think that's going to happen. But the longer it goes on, the more problematic it's going to get. And also, this particular Pentagon senior advisor was saying that, a lot of what is coming out of Ukraine in the corporate media is not true, and that the best thing that can happen is for Zelensky he could stop this right now. And the way to stop it really is to stop listening to U.S. empire whispering in its ear and dictating what they want, because every time he goes to do something that is possibly going to broker some peace with Russia, the next thing you know, he changes his mind after he's had a conversation with Biden. I mean, I'm sorry, but they're the most evil empire, and they really are quite prepared to let people die. Many thousands of people die if they can just let it go on and on and on. They have no interest in it coming to an end. And the amount of weapons that are being flooded into Ukraine, it's kind of reminds me a bit of what has happened in the past in Syria. And you'll end up with these moderate rebel kind of situations, and they're just going to be Nazis and violent militia. And also there are actually private militia have gone in there as well. So you're going to probably get a feed of private military people going in there and conducting a war against Russia on Ukraine soil. It's disgusting to use countries like this, but this is the modus operandi of the US empire. And they're too cowardly to do anything themselves, really. Usually they want to involve another country and fight, get that country in the middle of it and have them fight and feed in unsavory characters into it and flood them with weapons, hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons. It's so sad. It's so sad that this has happened. So anyway, check out these next excerpts. I'm sorry, I completely forgot his total title. He's got a colonel in there somewhere. Colonel Douglas MacGreger. Okay, so thanks for watching. Stay tuned.
Joining me live now is Colonel Douglas MacGreger, former senior advisor to the US Secretary of Defense. Thanks so much for your time. What is your take on what we're seeing publicly at the moment? It seems there's been phone calls, the US President Joe Biden once again warning that the US will step in if Russia invades. Is it now looking inevitable?
Well, I think it probably is. Keep in mind that the core issue for the Russians is a very straightforward one. They don't want any foreign forces or missiles from the United States stationed on Ukrainian soil. That's why they do not want Ukraine to become a member of NATO. So this entire crisis could have been avoided if we'd simply agreed to not expand NATO. A perfectly reasonable suggestion from the Russians, in my judgment. But now they have all of the forces in place. Some people think they still want more time, but I think they've got what they need. They have an integrated air defense capability that reaches from the Gulf of Finland down to the Black Sea. They can now strike at any targets in Western Europe that may host U.S. forces that for any reason would try to interfere with them. Now, clearly, the president has told his military leadership, we will not intervene. And I'm sure that we have no intention of doing so simply because we're in no position to fight a war in Eastern Europe against the Russians.
So why do you say that? Because Joe Biden has said to the Ukrainian leader, apparently, that he will not tolerate, the US will just not stand by if there is a Russian invasion. So how does this play out? I mean, we're being told that an invasion, an all-out war, could be coming within days. And I guess we're being fed propaganda by all sides.
Well, again, the United States and its leadership, since Biden took office, has been very hostile to Moscow on every conceivable issue. And I think Mr. Putin has called their bluff. We simply don't have the ground forces in place, neither do our European allies. We don't have the air and missile defense forces in place. We cannot interfere in this without being drawn into a war that, frankly, in Central East Europe, we cannot win. So I think Mr. Putin has called the bluff. And I think his message is very clear to the Germans, the Poles, and the others in Central East Europe. And that is, in this part of the world, Russia is the decisive power. No one can rescue you from us if we decide to move in. That's a very powerful message, and that's about to be sent.
This is really concerning for the United States, isn't it? It's got echoes of Obama's red line in Syria. I mean, if Biden doesn't follow through on his threats, you're looking at a weakened Western ally.
Well, I think you're right. And I think it's time for the Europeans to understand what Donald Trump tried to tell them for 4 years, which is that we in the United States cannot be your first responder. You must be prepared to defend yourselves. And in the event of a crisis, we can assist, but we cannot move forces across the Atlantic in short enough time to make any difference. This is a different world. We don't control the oceans as we once did. We can't ensure that we can put 150,000 troops on the ground that are capable of fighting. Right now, we're sending light forces. It's almost a joke, frankly. We're about to embarrass ourselves by sending anyone. So I think at the end of this, I would expect NATO to begin to break up. I don't think it's going to survive this crisis.
Colonel, one final question, because here in Australia, we're concerned about rising Chinese aggression. China will be looking very closely at what happens with Russia and Ukraine. If we don't have a strong response there, if the West doesn't have a strong response there, might China take that as a positive for it?
Well, first, you're going to have to prove to me that the Chinese are being aggressive militarily anywhere. They certainly aren't prepared to invade Southeast Asia. They are not preparing to invade Korea, and they absolutely are not prepared to try and invade Taiwan. Those things aren't going to happen. So I don't sign on for this picture of the aggressive military power in China. No. I think that you've got to talk to the Chinese and do business with them.
Do you buy the economic dominance in which they are seeking, the diplomatic influence as a precursor to that?
Well, the economic influence is real, and that is, it's up to you and others in Asia who have now signed, and I think you are signatories to the RCEP, the Regional Economic Comprehensive Program, which gives you effectively free trade access to the Chinese economy. So is Japan. I think as long as you understand the limits of Chinese influence and you understand what's at stake, then you can pick and choose from what you will or will not do. The Japanese are very good at that, and the Japanese have signed on for this, and I would follow their lead because the Japanese are very, very familiar with China and vice versa. Well, Vladimir Putin is carrying through on something that he's been warning us about, at least for the last 15 years, which is that he will not tolerate U.S. forces or their missiles on his borders, much as we would not tolerate Russian troops and missiles in Cuba. And we ignored him, and he finally acted. He was not going to allow Ukraine under any circumstances to join NATO. What's happened now is that the battle in eastern Ukraine is really almost over. All the Ukrainian troops there have been largely surrounded and cut off. You have a concentration down in the southeast of 30 to 40,000 of them. And if they don't surrender within the next 24 hours, I suspect that the Russians will ultimately annihilate them. That's why Zelensky is meeting with Putin's representatives right now. The game is over. And he's going to have to negotiate the best deal he can get. And we've already told him, the President of the United States has, that if he opts for neutrality for Ukraine, we'll back him. And I think that Vladimir Putin will do that for Western Ukraine. That is the Ukraine beyond the Dnieper River. But behind it in the east, where he is now, I'm not sure what he has planned there, whether he forms another republic, annexes it into Russia, because historically it has been Russian. But the territory west of Ukraine is not. He knows that, and he's happy to live with that as a neutral state.
I am not a military expert. I'm not even an expert on geography. But if he takes Ukraine and Ukraine abuts Poland, then he's going to have a NATO country abutting him. So if that's what he doesn't want, then isn't he going to just have to keep going until he runs out of NATO countries?
I guess I should say it again. He has no interest in crossing the Dnieper and heading west to the Polish border. I think you're going to find from these negotiations he's quite willing to neutralize that territory on the Austrian or the Finnish model. Right now, Russia already touches Estonia and part of Latvia. White Russia, of course, touches Lithuania. He's not interested in going to war with us, and he has an army that's too small for that purpose. And he knows it. His economy is smaller than that of South Korea's. So this is not something that he's looking for. We are imputing to him things that he does not want to do in our usual effort to demonize him and his country. We need to remember that Ukraine is fourth from the bottom of 158 countries in the world as corrupt. Russia is perhaps 3 or 4 places above them. This is not the liberal democracy, the shining example that everyone says it is. Far from it. Mr. Zelensky has jailed journalists and his political opposition. I think we need to stay out of it. The American people think we should stay out of it. The Europeans think we should stay out of it. And we should stop shipping weapons and encouraging Ukrainians to die in what is a hopeless endeavor.
So when you say stay out of it, you mean no sanctions, no military aid, just let Russia take the portion of Ukraine they want to take?
Yes, absolutely. I see no reason why we should fight with the Russians over something that they have been talking about for years. We simply chose to ignore it. And more important, the population there is indistinguishable from their own. You know, the thing that's so disturbing is that on the one hand, we will not send our forces to fight, but we are urging Ukrainians to die pointlessly in a fight they can't win. We're going to create a far worse humanitarian disaster than anything you've seen thus far if it doesn't stop. Well, the first 5 days, we witnessed a very slow, methodical movement of Russian forces into eastern Ukraine. That is Ukraine, the third of Ukraine, which is on the eastern side of this river called the Dnieper. They moved slowly, cautiously. They tried to reduce casualties among the civilian population, tried to give as many Ukrainian troops and forces as possible the opportunity to give up, to surrender. That is over. And the phase in which we find ourselves now, Russian forces have now maneuvered to encircle and surround the remaining Ukrainian forces and destroy them through a series of massive rocket artillery strikes, airstrikes, with Russian armor then slowly but surely closing the distance and annihilating what's left. So this is the beginning, frankly, of the end of Ukrainian resistance. Well, I think Vladimir Putin set out to honor his word of 2007. 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, he said, we will not tolerate the expansion of NATO to a point where your NATO, your border, is touching Russia, specifically Ukraine and Georgia. We see these as essentially Trojan horses for NATO's military power and U.S. influence, subversion, and so forth. He then turned to several opportunities to reinforce that over and over and over again, most recently with President Biden, in the hopes that he could avoid taking action to effectively clean out eastern Ukraine of any opposition forces whatsoever, and to put his forces in a position vis-a-vis NATO to deter us from any further attempts to influence or change Ukraine into effectively a platform for the projection of U.S. and Western power into Russia. Now, his goal, as we see it at the moment, is to seize this entire area of eastern Ukraine. That's pretty clear. He's going to roll up to that river. Up near Kiev, he's actually moved over the river and is preparing to go in and capture that city entirely. At that point, he has to decide what else he wants to do. I don't think he wants to go any further west. I think he'd be very satisfied to hold that point. But he would like whatever emerges from this that we call Ukraine, whether it's just the western side or it encompasses some of the east and the west of Ukraine, to be neutral, non-aligned, and preferably friendly to Moscow. That he will accept. Anything short of that, his war has been a waste of time.
How should the United States respond at this point?
Well, I think President Biden and Sullivan, his national security advisor, have already given some indication of their readiness to accept something like that. They're not going to have any choice. Either they accept it, or then they put him in the position of having to do more than he would like to do, which would probably not go down well with NATO. No one really wants Russian forces on their border, least of all Poland.
Right.
So I think Sullivan and Biden will essentially tell Zelensky, if he is still the president at that point, and if he's still running any semblance of the Ukrainian government, which is largely collapsing now, if he is still there, he's going to be told, accept the deal, go neutral, because there really is no choice. Well, you'd end up at war with Russia, because the Russians are not going to allow Western aircraft, U.S. aircraft, flying over the battlefield in eastern Ukraine under any circumstances. And Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, flew to Poland to stop the Poles from essentially offering MiG-29 aircraft that were improved and modernized to the Ukrainians, allowing their pilots to come to Poland, fly these into Ukraine. He put a stop to it, saying that anything like that could lead to war, and NATO will not go to war. And see, this is the interesting part. Now everyone is talking about spending lots of money on defense and lots of money for NATO, but very shortly people are going to begin to ask why. Why are we doing? Because it's patently obvious that NATO is not in a position to fight, not in a position to challenge the Russians. So I think Mr. Biden's problem tonight is not just his narrative is going to break down very rapidly over the next few days as it becomes obvious that this whole Ukraine business was a fantasy on his part. He's going to end up trying to write checks that he can't cash, because we can't afford a massive military. We can't afford to put more forces forward. And if we try to do it, it'll be self-defeating. So I think we're in a real crisis now that no one has really figured out yet, and that is NATO itself and our position on the European continent. All of this is now at risk. Well, two things. I think that Mr. Putin has priced in the cost. In other words, he's not a fool. He sat down with Xi in Beijing and made it very clear what he was going to do, what his goals were in eastern Ukraine, and only eastern Ukraine initially. And I think he got the conditions he wanted from Xi of support and assistance through this process, because he knew what we would try to do to him. We would try to destroy Russia financially, economically, in whatever way we could. Real strategic partnership, there's no question about it, because China needs Russia in order to secure Central Asia and all the routes to Europe. China wants to do business with Europe. That's why the Chinese would like Mr. Putin to end this quickly. But Putin insisted on those first 5 days slowing things down, because he wanted to minimize damage to property and he wanted to minimize the loss of life, particularly in the population that he was trying to bring into, effectively, a new Ukraine that is Russian. He's essentially discarded that now. So I think that's absolutely true. If China had not reassured him, we will stay the course with you, I doubt seriously that he would be doing this now.
The first 5 days, Russian forces, I think, frankly, were too gentle. They've now corrected that. So I would say another 10 days, this should be completely over. But the question is, what is it that Zelensky is going to do? The Russians have made it very clear what they want is a neutral Ukraine. This could have ended days ago if he accepted that. And then they can adjust the borders. But the eastern part of Ukraine is firmly in Russian hands. But again, the Russians are not seizing territory. They're destroying Ukrainian forces. That's their focus.
Colonel, it sounds like you don't approve of Zelensky's stand.
Oh, I think Zelensky is a puppet. And he is putting huge numbers of his own population at unnecessary risk. And quite frankly, most of what comes out of Ukraine is debunked as lies within 24 to 48 hours. The notions of taking and retaking airfields, all of this is nonsense. It hasn't happened.
He's not a hero when he's standing up for himself and his own people. You don't think he's a hero?
No, I do not. I don't see anything heroic about the man. And I think the most heroic thing that he can do right now is to come to terms with reality. Neutralize Ukraine. This is not a bad thing. A neutral Ukraine would be good for us as well as for Russia. It would create the buffer that, frankly, both sides want. But he's, I think, being told to hang on and try to drag this out, which is tragic for the people that have to live through this.
I'm inclined to disagree with you, Colonel, but, we'll see how this works out. Colonel Douglas MacGreger, tough guy. Thanks for being with us, sir. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.